All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JB. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. Before we get started, we want to send you all our well wishes during the current pandemic of COVID-19. We know that this is a very trying time, and even though vaccines are here, let us continue to do our part by practicing social distancing, washing our hands, and wearing our masks to slow the spread of this virus. And if we at Chin Check Radio can serve as a distraction to everything that's going on, that's something that we are proud to do and will continue to do. We thank you for your tremendous support. We are just a small program, just sharing our love with professional sports with you all. Now, on this broadcast, kind of going to switch gears up a little bit, and we're going to have a bit of a fun discussion, throwing points here and there. And all this stems from a recent podcast with NFL Hall of Fame wide receiver Terrell Owens, another Hall of Famer, Randy Moss, and another gentleman, and comments about who was the best wide receiver of all time. Now, if you go back and look at my all-time NFL greatest offenses, my receivers were Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, and Terrell Owens. And there's always been some good discussion about who's the best and who's the greatest. Obviously, right now, probably the biggest discussion in sports is who's the greatest. Is it Michael Jordan or is it LeBron James? Now, we live in a world now where people cannot have a difference of opinions. We live in a world now where people, if you don't agree with everything that I'm saying, I'm going to disregard everything else that you're saying. And that's not what we try to do. We try to listen to different points of views, have healthy debates, have healthy discussions, and if we can always agree to disagree. But it just seems that people, and I don't know if it's the political landscape that's now seeped into the sports landscape, where you're pretty much on one side or the other. You cannot have both. And people always dug into certain debates, even in the hip-hop world, with the late Biggie Smalls and the late Tupac Shakur. You literally had people who were solely Tupac fans who didn't like Big, and Big fans who didn't particularly care for Tupac. And I'm like, these are two great artists, two icons of their time, two of the greatest of all time. Why can't you like both? So, and mind you, this is back in the mid-1990s. So, this is one of those things where it's very polarizing. You're pretty much on opposite ends. The biggest comparison right now in professional sports would be who's the greatest, Michael Jordan or LeBron James. Obviously, Jordan's resume is already completed. LeBron James is already, he's continuing his resume. And even on Twitter, I mean, people get into nasty debates as to who's the best. It starts becoming personal. It really gets awful. And even in this conversation with Randy Moss giving his honest opinion about who he feels is the best wide receiver of all time. And these are actual comments that Randy has made before. Like, people forget, in that Super Bowl where the 49ers played the Baltimore Ravens during Media Day, Randy Moss said he felt he was the greatest wide receiver of all time. Jerry responded. And we're going to take a little bit of those comments, but we're simply going to have a good debate, a discussion like grown adults, to who you feel is the best wide receiver of all time. We're going to take a look at stats. We're going to bring a lot of arguments into the equation. So let's just have fun with it. Now, let's play the audio from this interview with Terrell Owens, Randy Moss, and this other guy. And of course, it's an hour-long interview. We're definitely not going to play the whole interview for an hour, but just some key parts to definitely discuss going forward.
That's it, man. I mean, everywhere that I went, I basically adjusted my game to not only the systems. Most of the systems I played in was sort of West Coast based, but I just, like I said,
you still put Jerry Rice as your number one receiver.
Yeah, I mean, I think statistically, yeah. I mean,
I didn't ask you statistically.
Yeah,
I said, Jerry Rice is the best receiver to ever play in the NFL, in your personal opinion.
Yeah, I think.
So, Randy, who's the best receiver to ever play in the NFL?
You're talking to him
Already. Okay. So
I put myself first. I'll put T.O. second. And I think Jerry's probably third or fourth. I'm talking about dominating the game and changing the game of football. I don't live on statistics, because if you live on statistics and live on championships, that's all political. You've seen guys cut, you've seen guys released or cut from a team just by a couple words in the media. You've seen guys given contracts, or you've seen guys not given contract just because the color of their skin. So I think that you gotta throw politics out of the game of football and look at the impact of what each individual was able to make in the game of football. I don't discredit anything that a guy like Marvin, Jerry, Terrell has done for the game. But when I look at the game of football and my impact of, being able to come in as a rookie, coming in hot, leaving hot, with all the double, with all the triple coverage coming in, I really don't like talking about being the best wide receiver of the game, because I never set my goals into being the best. But I think that at the end of the day, to look at a lot of accomplishments from the guys that they think that are at the top. I mean, rightfully so, T.O. could be one, Jerry could be one, anybody else could be one. But I think that when I look at myself, and I'm not looking at it in the highlights, just talking about the game of football, being able to come in as a rookie, set a record for being the highest scoring offense in the National Football League, and then being able to go back 10 years later and do it again. So just a lot of the impact of the game of football that I look at. I'm really not a big statistics guy. I'm really not.
Now, Randy was very respectful. He wasn't braggadocious. He wasn't bloviating. He was simply stating that he believes he's the greatest wide receiver of all time based on the impact. Now, obviously they were on my all-time greatest team because I had the privilege and the honor to watch all three of them play. Now, like Randy said, he doesn't take a look at it. He doesn't believe in stats, but at the same time, he did quote that leading these high-scoring offenses. So if we're looking at individual stats, I think it is something worth bringing up in terms of this particular conversation. I'm sure you all have done it. I'm sure you all done it as well. Now, the great T.O. Let me get my computer up and running here. The great Terrell Owens has 1,078 catches, 15,934 yards at 14.8 yards a catch and 153 receiving touchdowns. That is definitely stellar. And just some other records here. Only NFL player in NFL history to score a touchdown against all 32 NFL teams. Only NFL player in NFL history to score 2 or more touchdowns against all 32 NFL teams. Only player in NFL history to have an 800-yard receiving season with 5 different teams. Only NFL player in NFL history to have a 150-yard receiving game with 5 different teams. Only NFL player in NFL history to have a 200-yard receiving game with 3 different teams. Oldest player to accumulate 200 combined yards, receiving yards, and yards from scrimmage in a single game. Consecutive seasons with at least 6 touchdowns from 2000 to 2010. 11 tied with Marvin Harrison and Jerry Rice and Don Hudson. Consecutive seasons with at least 5 touchdown receptions, tied with Marvin Harrison, Chris Carter, Tim Brown, and Don Hudson. Consecutive seasons with at least 5 touchdowns, tied with Frank Gore, Marvin Harrison, Chris Carter, Tim Brown, Rice, and Don Hudson. Consecutive season with at least 4 touchdown receptions. Consecutive season with at least 4 touchdowns. Consecutive season with at least 3 touchdown receptions. Consecutive season with at least 3 touchdowns. Consecutive season with at least 700 receiving yards / yards from scrimmage / combined yards, tied with Tony Gonzalez. And one of 12 players that have at least 2 offensive touchdowns of more than 90 yards. So, a little bit about Terrell Owens' great Hall of Fame career. and I'll even say this, should have been a first ballot Hall of Famer, no questions asked. Let's go to Randy Moss. Randy Moss, a career that has 982 receptions, 15,292 receiving yards, 15.6 yards per reception, receiving touchdowns, 156. Some NFL records: most touchdown receptions in the season, which is 23, breaking Jerry Rice's record. Most touchdown receptions by a rookie in the season. Most seasons with 17 or more touchdown receptions, 3. Most seasons with 16 or more touchdown receptions, 3. Most seasons with 11 or more touchdown receptions, 8, tied with Jerry Rice. Most seasons with 10 or more touchdown receptions at 9, tied with Jerry Rice. Most games in the season with at least 2 touchdown receptions. One of 2 players to have 1,600 plus receiving yards and 16 plus receiving touchdowns in the season, the other being Calvin Johnson. Most yards receiving in a Pro Bowl game. Most touchdowns scored in the first 10 games with a new team. Most 1,200 plus receiving yard seasons to start a career. Moss has averaged at least 1 receiving touchdown per game in 4 different seasons. 4 times 100-yard games in the first 4 games with a new team. Youngest player in NFL history to record his 100 receiving touchdown. Youngest player in NFL history to record his 120th receiving touchdown. Most receiving yards before 30th birthday. Most touchdowns before 30th birthday. Youngest player to reach 6,000 career receiving yards. Fastest player to reach 5,000 to match 5,000 career receiving yards. That's 59 games. Broke the record of 61 games by Jerry Rice. The youngest player to reach 5,000 career receiving yards. Highest career yards per catch for any player with 900 plus receptions. The youngest player to have 3 touchdown receptions in a game. Most offensive touchdowns in 2 seasons. And of course, we can talk about, Pro Bowls and all Pro Bowl. We'll get to that. The great Jerry Rice. 1,549 receptions. Receiving yards, 22,895. 14.8 yards per reception and 197 receiving touchdowns. Here we go. Here's NFL records. Most career regular season games played by position player. Most career receiving yards. Most career receptions. Most career touchdown receptions. Most career yards from scrimmage. Most career touchdowns from scrimmage. Most career all-purpose yards. Most career all-purpose touchdowns. Most seasons of 1,000 or more receiving yards. Fastest players to reach 100 touchdown receptions. Fastest players to reach 13,000 receiving yards. Fastest player to reach 14,000 receiving yards. Fastest player to reach 15,000 receiving yards. So clearly, folks, these are some of the best wide receivers to have ever played. Now, to really have this discussion about who's the greatest, we can look at this from a lot of angles here. Now, I'm going to go to what Jerry Rice said, and I was watching it last night on YouTube, and when Jerry Rice kind of threw it in there that said, well, Randy Moss can be, while he's thinking he's the best and trying to win a Super Bowl, I've already won my Super Bowls. And yes, Jerry Rice did win Super Bowls. He won a bunch of Super Bowls. No questions about that. But here's my problem when you bring in the Super Bowl argument, is we tend to base athletes' greatness and their legacy based on championships and how many championships that they won. Now, let's go back to my basketball analogy. Michael Jordan won 6 NBA titles. So people said that's the benchmark for NBA. You can't even be in discussion until you come close to that. The late Kobe Bryant had 5 championships. LeBron James has won 4 championships. And looking like they can possibly win even 5 this year. So there's a good chance that LeBron James can actually catch up to and surpass Michael Jordan depending on how these final years in Los Angeles go. But then the question becomes, if LeBron passes Michael Jordan, then does that make LeBron James the greatest basketball player of all time? And the reason why I say that, because then the argument becomes, well, Michael went undefeated in the finals, while right now, as we speak, LeBron is 4-6 in the NBA Finals. So LeBron happens to win, let's say, 7 championships. He's 7-6 in the NBA Finals with 7 titles more than Michael, but Michael went 6-0. So is it titles or is it about how you win? And if we're basing it on titles, then wouldn't Bill Russell be the greatest NBA player of all time with 11 rings? So just some conversation. Now, let me bring this back to professional football. The easiest and I think the laziest answer, or the laziest, I think, discussion point or the debate point is to say, well, Jerry's won titles and Randy and T.O. haven't. Again, that's lazy, and here's why. I genuinely believe that Emmitt Smith is, at least in my lifetime, the greatest running back who's ever lived. Some simple as that, no question. I didn't grow up with Jim Brown and the late Gale Sayers. I didn't watch them. I grew up watching Emmitt Smith. I think Emmitt Smith is the greatest running back of all time. But people will argue, and probably some of you right now listening will say, no, Barry Sanders was better. So again, while T.O. and Randy played in the same era, Barry and Emmitt played in the same era. Now, the same people that will say that Jerry is better than Randy because Jerry has the rings. But now when it comes to Emmitt Smith, who has 3 Super Bowl rings, who has a Super Bowl MVP, but people will tell you that, well, wait a minute, Barry Sanders is actually the better running back than Emmitt Smith. So literally in the same conversation, a person will say, well, Jerry Rice has the rings and Randy doesn't. But then the same person will say that Barry Sanders is better than Emmitt Smith, even though Emmitt Smith has the rings. So that's definitely a discussion that I find people's hypocrisy to really see through. So again, we're not taking away championships, but sometimes that's a little lazy to say, well, said player is better than this player because he has a title. Let's face it, Dan Marino is one of the greatest quarterbacks I've seen in my lifetime. He does not have a Super Bowl. He's only went to 1 Super Bowl. He does not have a Super Bowl ring. Are you going to tell me that Trent Dilfer, Brad Johnson, and Jim Plunkett are actually better than Dan Marino? I'll even do one better. Is Kurt Warner even better than Dan Marino? I would say absolutely not. So don't get so blinded and lazy to say, well, titles make it and that's about it. So no, that's not how that works. So now this goes into statistics, which Randy says he doesn't judge people by, but it's something to work at. Jerry has every receiving record, all the receiving records. So that's part of the argument to say that Jerry, based on having all the records, he should be the greatest wide receiver of all time. But I'm going to go back to my basketball analogy. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar actually has the most points scored, and yet he doesn't really get thrown in the conversation of being the greatest of all time. Hell, some people don't even really consider maybe the greatest center of all time. That's a lot of discussion. But in terms of the greatest of all time, Kareem really doesn't get mentioned that much. I think Magic Johnson gets more mention than actually Kareem does. And Kareem actually is the all-time scoring leader. Sky Hook was unstoppable. And he also has rings even before he went to LA. So again, depending on who you ask, we tend to throw these points out there. And for some people it applies, and for other people it doesn't. Just some food for thought. Again, we're just having a simple, fun debate and fun discussion. Now, something that T.O. said, continuing on, that I didn't agree with. T.O. said that at the time where Jerry was at his peak, he played in the West Coast offense, which was the offense at that time under Bill Walsh. And of course, other coaches after that, even with George Seifert keeping the same team and Steve Mariucci, they kept some version of the West Coast offense. And even when he came to the Oakland Raiders to play under John Gruden, West Coast offense, and even with Bill Callahan, they still stay with the West Coast offense. That quick strike, those 5-yard or 6-yard passes, they actually serve as your runs. Kind of get the ball out of your hands quick, quick drops, and definitely going across the middle. Now, what T.O. said was at the time Jerry played, defenses weren't as complex than the time where Randy and T.O. played. So T.O. states that when Jerry played, defenses weren't as complex. I would agree with that. They weren't as exotic, and that was definitely the term that T.O. used. They weren't as exotic. But back then, they played defense and they hit you in the mouth. It wasn't no roughing the passer. And to their credit, Randy and T.O., they played in an era where you were still able to play defense. But we're talking that back then in the 80s and the early 90s where guys were getting hit. Guys were getting smacked around. So they weren't as complex, they weren't as exotic, but they were just flat out tougher back then. And we're talking the 85 Bears at that time when Jerry played, those New York Giants teams, and not even, I might even say the 85 Bears, but just those Bears teams in general always had great defenses. Those Giant teams with Lawrence Taylor had great defenses. Those Eagles team had solid defenses. Even people forget, those Cowboys teams of the 90s, even though you generally think of the triplets, folks forget that 1992 Dallas Cowboys team actually had the #1 ranked defense in football. And they were actually a faster defense that was kind of unseen for their time to have such a, because most defensive players are big and plodding, and you had such a fast defense. So Jerry consistently played against, I feel, in his era, quality, tough defense where back then you got smacked in the mouth. Now, when T.O. and Randy hit the scene, defenses were a little bit more complex. So now, when we go to impact, which is what Randy's argument was, and it's a fair point, and I mentioned this, Randy Moss took the league by storm right when he came into the league. And I think in terms of Randy Moss to me is the most gifted wide receiver that I've seen in my lifetime. I mean, in terms of physical gifts, tall, can run, athletic, everything with Randy. Just deep bomb, 4'1", 4.25 speed as a wide receiver. The only other person that comes close to the physical, and I'm talking about just physical gifts, stepping onto the football field and not caught a single pass. The only person that's close to that, I would say, is Calvin Johnson. But we're talking about just pure physical gifts, step onto a football field, and just dominate. Remember, Randy was a first-round pick. Randy should have went to the Cowboys. But through his own issues, getting kicked out of Notre Dame, getting kicked out of Florida State and going to Marshall, people obviously were concerned about his character, and that's why he fell in the draft. Calvin Johnson was a top 5 draft pick. T.O. was a late-round draft pick, so T.O. was more, obviously, good scouting eye by Bill Walsh. So, and with Jerry coming from Mississippi Valley State, small school, again, good scouting by Bill Walsh. But Randy did come into the league, and he clearly was unstoppable from the first time he stepped on the football field. No questions asked. When that's even not up for debate or not up for discussion. Where I agree with Randy with what he's saying about his impact is if you look at why the cover 2 became so prevalent, especially with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who at that time were in the same division, the whole NFC Central. If you go back and why we know it, that cover 2, it became the thing to do, especially against the type of receivers to have safety coverage and pretty much double team, is because of one Randy Moss. Randy Moss made, especially that 98 Minnesota Vikings team, job so easy. What all Randall Cunningham had to do was throw the ball up in the air deep, get a pass interference call at the 1-yard line, and the Vikings were scoring touchdowns. That was pretty much their offense. Heave the ball up. They couldn't jump with Randy, and I believe in Randy, that famous quote when he says, "Throw it up in the air and they can't jump with me." Golly! And Randy definitely was the reason why that Vikings team was the highest scoring team of that time. And we're talking throw the ball up in the air, come down with it, get a pass interference call, you just got a 50, 60-yard penalty, and you got an easy touchdown. So that was Randy's impact. The Green Bay Packers, after getting torched by Randy Moss, spent their entire draft drafting defensive backs. That's the impact that Randy Moss had on the game of professional football. I would say another impact that Randy and T.O., I'm going to say to a certain extent, I'm going to throw T.O. in discussion because T.O. himself was physically bigger. He was bigger than Jerry Rice. Not as tall as Randy Moss, but stocky, well built. T.O. was put together and is still put together even in his mid-40s. So I will give Randy and T.O. this credit because of their physical gifts is what gave the rise to these bigger cornerbacks. So now teams were looking for cornerbacks who at least, because remember back then your corners 5'8", 5'9", 5'10". Now you have corners, the Richard Shermans of the world. Your corners, 6'1", 6'2", 6'3", 210 pounds, 215 pounds. That was solely because of the Randy Mosses and the Terrell Owens. Well, now teams now have to find bigger corners who can physically lock up. And keep this in mind. If you have a wide receiver in a T.O. and a Randy who's 6'3" and 6'4", they're easy going above your corners 5'10", 5'11". If you get a corner who is, let's say, 6 feet tall or 6'1" because of $190, T.O. is going to just roll right through him. Randy would just roll right through him, but Randy's game was more of speed. So, and obviously leaping ability. So now, because of that, now you have corners who are able to jump out of a building much like wide receivers. You have corners who are almost, corners running 4.4 and 4.5s just to keep up with the Randys and the T.O.s of that time. So I agree with Randy's impact on the game. No questions asked. Again, the Packers spent their one entire draft drafting mostly defensive backs. You had the rise of the cover 2 defense as well. And again, I'm going to throw a T in there. The rise of your bigger cornerbacks who can physically match these wide receivers. So yes, that's the impact that they had on the game. Now with Jerry Rice, if you want to find an NFL player who is the equivalent of a Michael Jordan, would be Jerry Rice. And here's why. Michael Jordan had a singular focus coming into the league, especially as the pressure got to him and he started winning titles. Michael had a singular focus, a unrivaled work ethic, that whole famous shooting 500 jump shots inside the gym during the summer to improve his game. Michael had just a laser-like focus in order to be the best. You watch that Last Dance documentary, had no patience with teammates, was telling teammates while you're trying to get ready and you're trying to get your mind right, I'm trying to win the title. Jerry Rice was the same way. Jerry Rice had work ethic. Now again, Jerry Rice was not as physically gifted as Randy Moss. And I don't even go a step further. I don't even think he's as physically gifted as T.O. But what Randy had, and I'm not saying that T.O. or Randy didn't have work ethic. I'm not saying that. But Jerry had tremendous work ethic where go back and go Google or YouTube some old videos of Jerry, because the names get Jerry and Randy, they just throw me off. Go look at some videos of Jerry running up this steep hill. And I'm talking about sprinting up the hill where people would do a slight jog. Even myself, when I go work out and I run up hills, my steps get very choppy. I mean, Jerry is sprinting up this hill like it's nothing and didn't even seem to get tired. Other NFL players, his teammates who worked out with him, said how they fell out. You heard clips of Jerry Rice saying people from San Francisco that the day after they won the Super Bowl, Jerry Rice was on the field catching passes. So Jerry Rice, like Michael Jordan, had, I would even say, an insatiable drive and appetite and hunger to be the best that they could be, to be the top not only of their particular position, but on top of their sport, and to even be one of the greatest athletes. I mean, Jerry Rice can make an argument, not even just the greatest wide receiver of all time, but one of the greatest football players of all time. So, and the record should support that as being possibly one of the greatest. Some people say Jim Brown, some people say Emmett, some people say Jerry. So, Barry Sanders, Lawrence Taylor. So, Jerry Rice, if you ask the greatest football player of all time, most people will tell you Jerry Rice at least. You're probably not going to get past 5 names and not mention Jerry Rice. That's just the reality of it. And Jerry, like Michael, worked hard. I mean, it's the famous story of they were playing the San Diego Chargers in the Super Bowl. Deion Sanders took some players and they hung out during the week past curfew. Jerry told them, hey, we didn't come to play. We didn't come to party. We came to win the Super Bowl. And that's Jerry being a leader. And Jerry was definitely focused on business. Again, it might have rubbed some people the wrong way. But sometimes an athlete who has a singular focus to be the best is his greatest strength, and at the same time, it could be his greatest weakness. So that's where I compare Jerry and Michael, and I would say that they're one and the same, is that they pushed themselves to become the best. Again, even though Michael was a top draft pick, but other players were seen as better than Michael, and look what Michael became. And Jerry, with his work ethic, making teammates fall out and stuff. So Jerry clearly made it happen. Now, what's funny about Jerry Rice, even though Randy has that top-end speed, T.O. has a top-end speed. Folks, if you can go Google videos of Jerry Rice, can you tell me when Jerry was ever caught from behind? You never saw Jerry, and again, I don't know back then how they measured 40-yard dash speed. I believe if you look at Jerry, they say he ran a 4.6, 4.7, but you never saw Jerry caught from behind. And if anything, you always saw Jerry getting good separation when he caught passes across the middle or even deep balls and pretty much blowing past DBs. So I don't see that. Jerry just had it. Jerry had the work ethic. Now, let's go again to Randy's impact. Randy had the Minnesota Vikings, the 1998 Minnesota Vikings, within a missed field goal of going to the Super Bowl. And that's one of the greatest Super Bowls that I feel that we missed out on, was that Vikings team versus that Broncos team going for a repeat with John Elway, Shannon Sharp, and Terrell Davis. That would have been one of the greatest Super Bowls of all time. In 2007, goes to the New England Patriots and breaks every record of that 1998 Minnesota Vikings team. Tom Brady wins the MVP based on Randy Moss. And again, Randy Moss had 23 touchdowns, which broke the record of Jerry Rice, but Jerry Rice did it in lesser games. So that's the funny part. He did it in lesser games. Even though Randy has a record, he broke Jerry Rice's record, but Jerry, and I forget what the old record was, in much less games. So again, no slight to anybody. These are just facts. But again, that's the impact that Randy had on teams. Rookie year, 1998, takes the league by storm. The Vikings set every offensive record. 9 years later with the New England Patriots, first year of the Patriots, and again, this is a down year. People didn't take Randy seriously. He was with the Oakland Raiders, had especially his second year in Oakland, had a down year. People thought he was finished. I don't know what Bill Belichick got a third or fourth round draft pick, and if I'm wrong, please tell me I'm wrong. And was able to get Randy Moss, and you saw they took the league by storm and were pretty much within a couple of plays from actually winning a Super Bowl. So Randy is right. The impact that he had on teams, you can't argue with that. He's 100% correct. But Jerry also had impact on teams because, again, he was an integral part of those 49er teams. Now, T.O. said something interesting, that who Jerry played with. Jerry did play with Joe Montana, who some people believe is the greatest quarterback of all time. Other people say Tom Brady. After Joe Montana, he played with Steve Young, who's another Hall of Fame quarterback. The only Hall of Fame quarterback that Randy Moss played with was Tom Brady for those few years in New England. You had Randall Cunningham. I believe Jeff George was a quarterback one year. You had Dante Culpepper. Whoever they had in Oakland, Tom Brady, and eventually, I believe Brett Favre for 1 year, but that's an older Brett Favre in Minnesota back in 2010. So you can think of that one quarterback really at his peak was Brady, and that's in 2007. Jerry played with Joe Montana and Steve Young. T.O. played with the older version of a Steve Young. Again, that famous catch when he caught it in between two Green Bay Packers, that pass was from Steve Young. Eventually, Jeff Garcia, Donovan McNabb, Tony Romo. I forget who the quarterback was in Buffalo. Carson Palmer in Cincinnati. So you figure one quarterback at the tail end of his career, and even the impact that T.O. had. Remember, the Eagles, who have been to 3 straight NFC Championship games, got T.O. They took the league by storm. Even on a broken leg, the guy played his heart out. And really it was, and I'm going to say this, and I've always been a Donovan McNabb fan, but that Super Bowl against the Patriots, McNabb stunk up that stadium. Goes to Dallas. Now we know how to end it in Philadelphia. Goes to Dallas, helps lead the Cowboys, especially in his second season there, to a 13-3 record, top seed in the NFC. We all know what happened there, going to Cabo, Jessica Simpson and the Giants, and blah, 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 blah. So we all know what happened. So between T.O. and Randy, there's always been, and I was glad to see them together on this program, and I mean together, they were actually speaking to each other. And because there was always been, and I think more from T.O., a little bit of competition, and I'm not going to say jealousy, but a little bit of competition with Randy, because again, these two were seen as the two best receivers of their time. Yeah, you could throw in Marvin Harrison, but it was generally T.O. and Randy. Now, when we go to Jerry played, I figured during the time he played, you had John Taylor, you had Michael Irvin, you had Herman Moore, you had Sterling Sharp, the brother of Shannon Sharp, you had Andre Reed. So, but even all those players aren't in the league of a Jerry Rice, even though Skip Bayless will tell you that he would pick Michael Irvin over Jerry Rice. That's his opinion. It is what it is. So it's definitely, you can look at it from a couple of ways here. We can look at it from a stats perspective, and that's what the gentleman was trying to get out of T.O. If you don't think of statistics, would you still have Jerry as your top? And T.O. flat out said, yes, I think Jerry is the best wide receiver of all time. T.O. says no. Randy says no, you're looking at me. So he has a right to his opinion. I'm not upset about that. I look at it from a different perspective. You can let me know what you think. I don't really ask for comments like that, but if you want to leave some in the comment section, that's fine. Obviously going to post this to our Twitter account. So I felt that it was something fun to talk about, something to discuss, something to have fun with, and whoever you feel is the greatest wide receiver of all time, it doesn't matter. I think it's great. I think it was a fun thing. I think it got people talking. I think let's have these fun sports debates and fun sports discussions rather than delving into personal attacks and you're an idiot and you're this and you're that. We try to analyze it from a bunch of different perspectives. And if we happen to miss something, definitely let us know if we missed something. So until the next time, this is Chin Check Radio signing out.